Welcome to Saving Europe. I'm the novelist and historian Henry Viner Brooks, and in this series we're following the lives and travels of two of history's unsung heroes. The decisive leadership shown by the 6th century monk Columbanus and the 20th century statesman Robert Schumann helped rescue Western civilization in two very different dark ages. So, joined by my two sons, I'm on a 4,000-mile, 12-country post-Brexit odyssey to find out if these men and these dark ages can teach us anything for today. In this episode, we follow Columbanus to the cultural epicentre through which he must surely have passed. And so in Pavia, at the tombs of Augustine, Boethius and the Ostrogoth kings, we come closer still to that generation who not only survived the collapse of Roman civilization, but also preserved the lamp of faith and learning for the generations that would follow.
Why, he has had more impact probably on Western culture than all the armies that ever marched.
If you're finding this content helpful, then please return the favour by liking this video, subscribing to the channel and perhaps even sharing it with a friend. And also do check out the new book which accompanies this series. Thanks for watching.
Just crossing the mighty Po Basin. That is a big river. It cuts across the entire north of Italy on its way down toward Ravenna, Venice, that area. It collects all the water out of the Alps, pretty much. All those great lakes that we see on postcards, the Po takes down to the sea, to the Adriatic.
This is the church of St. Peter's, and it's where Augustine is buried. It's also the place where Boethius is buried, who was the chamberlain to King Theodoric. This is a later basilica built over the original one, but Augustine's tomb is still inside.
There has been a church to St. Peter recorded here before Columbanus' time, but this was substantially renovated by King Liutprand a century later. I was intrigued by the knotwork on the portal columns, and though these are later Romanesque carvings, you cannot but feel the presence of those Teutonic and Celtic elements within the carving.
Oh my goodness. This is magnificent. The church gets its name from the gold ceiling.
Liutprand's church, of which only the apse remains, was laid out according to the measurement of his royal foot, and he too is buried here. The centrepiece of Liutprand's church, and placed right under the golden ceiling, are the bones of Augustine. Bede tells us that it was the king's uncle who ransomed the bones at great expense from the Saracens in Sicily. Stranger still, they were eventually forgotten and only rediscovered by workmen after almost 1,000 years under the church pavement.
So Augustine's tomb is just up here. Why, he has had more impact probably on Western culture than all the armies that ever marched. He's one of those people that get better on acquaintance. I wish I'd read more about him earlier. He's an African, and we often forget the African influence on Christianity. So he was raised as a Christian by his mother, though he rejected it, because his father wasn't a Christian. His mother, Monica, must have been a most extraordinary woman, because she prevailed with her prayers. Augustine was a profound scholar. No one would write Latin like him for hundreds of years. He kept a mistress from the age of 17, and he fathered a son by her who he looked after. Years later, he travelled to Rome as a hired teacher, rhetorician. He had classes. He was very popular. His mother followed him from Africa to Italy. He was more Greek than he was African. He embraced the works of Plato with abandon, and he wanted to establish a kind of community of other scholars, and they kind of worked out a way with his mates up this way near Milan to live up toward one of the lakes. Basically, his friends' girlfriends wouldn't have it, the women wouldn't have it, so he kind of scuppered this kind of scholarly community that he had in mind. Years later, he was converted under the preaching of Ambrose of Milan. Back in Africa, he founded what we would now call the Augustinian order, and his writings are voluminous. His great work, the Civitas Dei, the City of God, he writes this book as the great Volkerwanderung, the great barbarian hordes crisscrossing Europe, devastating the empire. And he has a message of hope. Firstly, he is saying it is not Christianity that has caused this problem. But secondly, he is saying that the city of God is not Rome. It is a place of kind of ultimate justice. It is a heavenly kingdom. A lot of what he wrote in the early years was heavily influenced by Plato and the Greek thinkers. And years later he wanted to write some recantations. His legacy now is mixed. He does provide justification for force against a sect called the Donatists, but there's so many good things about his writing and his polemicism, the stand he took. We must give thanks for the man that he was, how later generations took him. You know, none of us can be responsible for that. He dies even as the barbarians, I think it's the Vandals, are battering down the doors of Thagast, and he is remembered here, an Algerian, we would call him. It actually says Algerian on the sign, and we just give thanks for his life.
Love him or hate him, and there are plenty of both, Augustine was a key literary witness to the calamities of the 4th and 5th centuries. And so before descending to Boethius' tomb in the crypt, it's worth spending a few more minutes exploring why Rome fell, how Rome fell, and what it felt like to be alive back then. It was something I was able to do later in a park on the Caelian Hill in Rome.
I'm surrounded here by Roman ruins. You can see to an arch behind me and all these bits of old stone someone's cobbled together. Let's talk about that. Let me just read a little section from the first draft of the manuscript. As Roman martial vigour weakened, so too did their ability to secure shipping lanes, which grew increasingly piratical. This and other factors made civic life eventually untenable. Rome itself had grown from the spoils of war and lived on the corn supplied by Sicily and Africa. In her long decline, the city of Rome manufactured nothing, and her chief trade was money lending. It was not a sudden catastrophe for Rome, but a series of events and factors working together over a long period of time. One factor was a dangerous decline in revenues from an uneven taxation, which contributed to a disappearing middle class. Another factor was an unwieldy and self-serving bureaucracy whose survival became its ultimate goal. But in truth, Rome had been experiencing economic decline for 200 years before the final collapse. The emperors of old could not, as they do today, simply borrow against the future, but they could and did debase the denarius currency. This was done to the point that the purchasing power of money declined inexorably, and prudent people began to move out of the cities and invest in land. Away from the crumbling urban centres and the rampant inflation, the patrician might hope perhaps to ride out the recession in his self-sufficient villa with his family slaves, workshops and harvests. This essentially is why the city shrunk. Bordeaux contracted to less than a third of its former size, Autun even more, from 500 to just 25 acres, a mere 5% of its former glory. Something else to note about this period was the actions of the rich. In Italy, the wealthy plundered the civic buildings to edify their own estates. So when you see the noble ruins of Roman Italy, remember that to some extent this is what a grasping elite did to their own civilization. In the case of patricians pilfering stone from the civic structures, the emperor's edict was simple enough. A fine of £50 of gold for a magistrate found guilty, and for anyone else assisting them, flogging or the loss of both hands. In the first half of the 5th century, a period when Patrick wrote his great polemic letter against slavery, there were mass enslavements of free Romans too. The patrician landlords employed special agents called redemptores to buy back slaves from the barbarian raiders, not to free them, but to make them lifelong serfs on their own estates. So let's remember, when the chips were down, the restless rich proved ruthlessly adaptive in their own narrow interests. They did not have to wait for Machiavelli, Mandeville or Malthus for a justification to behave without honour to their fellow human beings. But let us leave the rich and let us move on to those so-called barbarians. Stereotypes aside, the immigrants who crossed the Rhine introduced soap to the Romans and were notable for cleaning their teeth. Some later ones were even Christians, though of the Aryan variety. Driven by climate change and seismic geopolitical upheavals, as far east as Afghanistan, they came wave after wave. And they did not come necessarily to destroy, but to enjoy the empire. It was just bad timing. In the late 4th century, the Christian Romans entered into an allegiance with their eastern enemy, Persia. In a strategic defense alliance, rather like the Americans and Germans within NATO as a bulwark against the USSR, the Romans helped part fund and staff a 125-mile-long wall between the Caspian and the Black Seas in order to hold back the barbarian invaders. The successive waves of invasions in the 5th century displaced the old order, and in its place welded the Latin and Teutonic elements into the medieval synthesis. 60 or so generations ago, they had started their journey to becoming us. Tragedy, and perhaps the cautionary tale against Western cultural hubris, is shown in Alaric's sack of the Eternal City here in 410. Rome had been impregnable for nearly 800 years. It was simply inconceivable. And when news reached Jerusalem, Jerome, talking about the person who brought the message, the speaker's voice failed and sobs interrupted his speech. The city that had conquered the whole world had itself been conquered. Who could believe it? The mother of the nations had become their tomb. Most Romans were unwilling to see how far they had fallen, that they were so very far from what they had been. How else could we explain their putting up with the insolence of the army, who replaced emperors with such alarming rapidity, even auctioning the empire on one occasion to the highest bidder? How else can we explain why an insipid and middling poet like Ausonius could be elevated to the position at the emperor's side? Gibbon rightly says that the fame of Ausonius condemns the taste of the age. This was a civilization in a rigor mortis of cultural calcification, tepid, vapid, rootless, rearranging the chairs while the great ship went down, and the unthinkable had happened. Rome had fallen. Christians like Salvian had bewailed the collapse. Why does God allow us to be weaker and more miserable and to be conquered by those barbarians? The answer of the Christian conscience was obvious. It was a punishment of sin. The pagans like Zosimus blamed the unfolding catastrophe, of course, on the Christians. They'd angered the traditional gods. For him, it was not an opinion. For Zosimus, it was a fact. But Augustine disagreed. His great polemic, De Civitas Dei, City of God, was his answer. The city of God, he wrote, would always endure. The city of God was not Rome, and it was not, as later ages misunderstood, the papacy or the church militant, but rather the embodiment of God's justice and God's truth in his people, past and present and future. This divine justice, this new humanity looking, quote, for a heavenly city whose builder and maker was God, that was the city of God. This is why for Augustine the fall of the Western Empire was not as serious as the fall of justice on earth. For him, Rome might fall, But in any case, Christ had arisen, so there was always hope for societal renewal. What might seem like pious rhetoric and wishful thinking is not so, and we remember that it was not really the powerful and the so-called practical people of that age that eventually saved it, but the otherworldly adherents to the new religion. And it was not as if they were all flippant optimists either. When surveying the scene 2 centuries later, Gregory the Great, who grew up just literally across the lane from this wall in front of me, wrote that there was no second way to interpret the tumultuous times other than that the end of the world had come. And quote, "Even if the gospel should be silent about it, the world itself would proclaim. Beaten down by so many blows, the ancient kingdom has fallen from its glory and shows us another kingdom which is coming, which is already near, and if then, when the world is still shrinking beneath us, we still love it and cling to it," writes Gregory, "it is because we wish to perish with it." If we just did a quick survey of those, who were those barbarians. Remember, a barbarian was anyone who just basically wasn't Roman. At a glance, we could say that Alaric, who sacked Rome, passed down into Sicily, then disappeared. The Visigoths and the Vandals vanished into Spain and then North Africa, finally merging with the Arab Empire. The Lombards reached as far as Benevento, but then they too were assimilated. The Huns, led by the terrible Attila, were some of the most successful of them all. They were warriors and horsemen from their youth, heads misshapen by applying boards, faces smooth from the scraping of the cheeks flesh of the boy so that beards didn't grow. These merciless warriors were almost universally successful. We can thank them for Venice, for it was desperate Romans fleeing the Huns who ended up on those marshes building a new town civilization. But Attila was finally defeated in central France by an alliance, not of Romans, for the Romans were gone, but of other barbarian enemies. We have no time to speak of the Alans, the Gepids, the Suevi, the Nurians, the Bastanians. The Ostrogoths, however, we must mention, for they left their mark under Theodoric, whose story does touch Columbanus.
And of course, there is nowhere better to meet them than back where we started in Pavia. In the crypt, directly beneath Augustine's bones, is the tomb of Boethius, a philosopher-statesman who lived a century after Augustine. By now, the so-called barbarians had begun to settle down in their chosen territories, and forward-looking Italians like Boethius could rise quickly in the New World Order if they played their cards right. Of course, they could fall even quicker. Boethius had been a consul at the age of 25 and a few decades later boasted that he had managed to raise both his sons to that august station. His Ostrogoth master, Theodoric, tried to emulate Roman culture as much as possible. He said, "An able Goth wants to be like a Roman. Only a poor Roman would want to be like a Goth." His sister was lady-in-waiting to the Byzantine empress, and he himself had grown up there. He wrote to the emperor, "Our royalty is a copy of yours, the only empire on earth." And he had had his coins stamped with the words Roma Invicta, unvanquished Rome. Alas, everyone wanted it to be true.
Well, it's extraordinary to be at the tomb of Boethius. I want to do a little reading from my book, Saving Europe, while I'm down here underneath the church. Columban was the king and queen's guest for some months, and it is therefore probable that he visited Pavia, which was only a day's journey to the southwest. It was at Pavia in 476 AD that the Western Roman Empire ended, and where Roman rule ceased in Italy. The usurping general, Odoacer, was defeated by Theodoric on the 15th of March, 493. And then he was assassinated at a banquet meant to establish concord between them. In other words, Theodoric stood up. Odoacer was next to him. He got a knife out and did the deed in front of all the guests. Because Theodoric lavished money on this city and expanded it, Pavia has some sites from a century before that make it a place of historic pilgrimage. It was here that Theodoric built the Roman-style amphitheatre and the bath complex, which was probably among the very few still functioning outside the Eastern Roman Empire in Columbanus' day. It was here at Pavia in 522 that Boethius, whose bones I am looking at, he was a sort of prototypical Thomas More of his day. He became the Magister Officiorum, which is in a sense the head of the government and the judiciary. He was a feverish Hellenist, like Augustine. He was always happier, really, with his Aristotelian and Platonic texts than he was with the Bible. But he finally got his solitude while accused of treasonous correspondence with the Byzantine emperor, and he was jailed in one of Pavia's churches, and it was here, over a 3-year period, before his execution, he wrote his Consolation of Philosophy, for which he is almost always remembered. Columban was passing through just before the golden age of Lombard patronage for Pavia, where many great monasteries and great churches were constructed, including the 7th century monastery of Santa Maria Teodote, which became the resting place of the Lombard kings. And it is to there that we go now. Santa Maria Teodote. This, when we get in there, was the great tombs of the Lombard kings. They were Germanic. They'd been in the pay of someone else's army, but when they came as mercenaries to northern Italy, they rather liked it. They thought they'd settle down.
The rule of the Lombards lasted 200 years. Begun in 572 when King Alboin captured the city after a long siege, which incidentally is epically recorded by Paul the Deacon. The 7th century Monasterio di Santa Maria Teodote was the oldest and the most important convent in Pavia. And though it was founded after Columbanus' time during the reign of the Lombard king Cunibert, it nevertheless was run on the rule of Columbanus during the 2 centuries of Lombard rule. It is named Teodote after the king's mistress, who he entered there.
The Santa Maria Teodote is the resting place of the Lombard kings. This was the royal burial place. So we're going to go see if we can find it. It looked like the place was under construction.
The only evidence left today of this 1,000-year nunnery is a terracotta relief in the 15th century cloister. In fact, I was disappointed to find that almost every vestige of the Lombard and medieval structure, including the tombs, had been replaced. The Lombard oratory of San Michele was rebuilt in 1604 on the plan of a Greek cross, with central and corner domes, and richly frescoed by Bernardino di Rossi. The only surviving remnant of the 7th century are 2 carved plutii, which are among the finest specimens of Lombard sculpture in existence. Amazingly, Pavia does actually possess 2 crypts that survive from the 7th century. One was only discovered in the 1960s. This, the crypt of Eusebius, was once the burial site for the Arian bishops, who still stare back at you across the centuries from faded frescoes. The other crypt dates to 654 and is under the church of San Giovanni Domnarum. It was built by Queen Gundeberga, daughter of Theodelinda and Agilulf, a young woman who was in her late teens when Columbanus was at her parents' court. Her husband, Arioald, a confirmed Arian, had her and Agilulf's natural heir locked up in monasteries. She must have funded this, the first Catholic church in Pavia, when she was in her mid-60s. The name suggests that it was a place for women to be baptized into Catholic, that is, non-Arian, Christianity. so she remained her mother's daughter to the end. Next time on Saving Europe, we finally enter the Trebbia Valley. We pass the site of Hannibal's great battle, and we explore the remains of Columbanus' final monastery. We talk about his last years and visit the tomb, and camp high in the mountains while seeking out the cave where he died. All this next time on Saving Europe. Remember also that this journey was part of the research for a book which uses the lives of Columbanus and Schumann to explore the unlikely arrival, survival, victory and atrophy of European civilization. Do follow the links below to find out more. Please let us know what you thought of this episode, what you liked, what you didn't, what was new to you. Just start a conversation below in the comments section. And of course, if you found the content helpful, then we're pretty sure you're going to like this next one suggested here. But also while you're there, don't forget to help us by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.